All right. Hi, Andy again. We're part four, halfway through the AI series. Really, this last half is getting into the meat, the fun meat of it. The first three were kind of the background preliminaries to get everyone to the point where everything makes sense now. So let's dive on right on in because I'm excited. Okay, so what we're talking about today is the impact of LLMs on learning, having talked last time about how people learn and the parts before about how LLMs work at all, right? So we're basically here. And just to recap, in case it's been a while since you saw those parts or you didn't see them at all. If you didn't, check it out. They're super awesome. But anyways, the recap is, we went over how LLMs work. They don't have a sense of ground truth. They're a statistical relationship between words or images. So they're not grounded in the world in the way that people do. They were instead designed to produce output that we like, we find helpful, we think is helpful at least, as we'll see, it's not necessarily always the same as actually being helpful. We interpret as friendly, plausible, helpful, and so forth. Which means that errors are inevitable and hard to see, and you need often expertise to be able to pick up on the details that are wrong. Humans, by contrast, when we're learning things, we actually need to practice and do stuff in order to learn it. We need fluency at the lower levels to be experts at the higher level, and there's no substitute for just doing things. And when we're doing assessments, the whole purpose of them is to force us to basically do that kind of practice, the kind of practice we need. The process of doing that is the point of it, and it can't be skipped without really hurting learning. That's what we know about human learning. So what does this mean about how LLMs impact it? All right, let's have a look. Now, I want to caveat this with saying, because LLMs are new, the research on this is new. And so I'll be talking about what I've found, and reporting on the higher quality studies that I've found. There's a lot of fairly low quality studies because it's new. That always happens. You're trying to get things out and figure out how to study it. So I'll be just addressing the work I think is good. But we know stuff about human learning, and so we can kind of set up some expectations of what we might expect to find. Right? So in what situations would LLMs be helpful, and what situations would they be hurtful? And what I'll be reporting on is what I found, right? So they might be helpful. We might expect them to be helpful if they actually provide opportunities for targeted and appropriate practice for the skills that you actually care about. We know practice matters, so if they actually help people practice better, that should be a good thing, right? Also, if they can actually give accurate and specific feedback to that practice, that would be a good thing too, because, and this is in principle what people say LLMs help with a lot, and one instructor has many, many students. If an LLM can give tailored feedback, that should be a good thing. Emotionally, they should be helpful for learning if they make people feel supported in their learning while also encouraging autonomy and self-reliance and confidence. And if they can facilitate deeper thinking and integration of ideas, that should be a good thing too. Now, all of these are ifs. We'll see to the extent that actually happens, but I think that is, if you're seeking to use an LLM, you can ask yourself, is it doing any of these things? Is it actually doing any of these things? And if it is, I would say they might be helpful in the abstract. Now, I expect conversely, they might be harmful if they hinder the development of the fluency of lower level skills, if they let you jump over that without practicing those things, so you never actually get that lower level fluency, you never offload that into long-term memory, or if they disrupt the kinds of processes that that build critical thinking and the integration of ideas, if they stop you from acquiring the kind of knowledge you need to spot the errors. Remember, that's the kind of, you need detail. The errors LLMs make are often in the details, and detail requires advanced knowledge. So if they stop you from acquiring it, not only will you not catch the errors, but you won't even know what you don't know. And emotionally, you would expect they would be harmful if they remove people's motivations or sense of agency as an active learner and become sort of dependent on them. So again, this is all abstract. These are principles. Let's look at what the actual research reveals. When are they helpful? And my bias as a teacher has been, they're probably not very helpful. So I try very hard to overcome these biases and give them as good of and as fair of a reading as I could, while again, sort of concentrating on the high quality studies. So this is what I found. So one of the things that I had the bias of was to think that LLMs might be pretty good at second language learning in the sense of, to the extent they provide a conversation partner, because that's actually literally what they were designed to do, is create language. They do create grammatical language. That sounds good, and that's what you need in a conversational partner. So I fully had the expectation that large language models, using them as a conversational partner, not to necessarily teach the language, but just to talk to, that this should actually help second language learning. Possibly my search skills aren't very good or whatever. I can't actually find evidence for or against this. I can't find where it was tested. There are some things about LLMs or AI and language learning, but not really in this conversational partner way. So this is something that I'd actually love to see research on, because I suspect it might help, but I actually don't know because this has not been tested. What I did find is there is some stuff showing that, AI helps with language learning, but it's really, I want to make clear again, this is AI and not large language models. So AI is in purpose-built computer programs designed to help with a particular aspect of language learning. So they don't work like LLMs. They don't have the downsides of it. And it turns out they might be helpful, right? So this study, basically, essentially, they have an AI that sort of is a question answering thing, kind of, I think, similar to some of the stuff in Duolingo. It augments it, and it turns out, that a group that was given this did better. They didn't really match for time spent, so you don't know if the control group, if they just had equal amount of practice not with this AI, would be as good. Was it the AI or was it just the extra practice time? I don't know, but it did find some improvements with the AI group. And there's also some work showing that, using Duolingo helps. But, again, this is not LLMs and AI in the sense we mean, and really pretty small sample size means, not sure about how much this generalizes. Still, I'm trying to be as fair as possible, and these were two of the best studies that I found that sort of showed some improvement with some kinds of AI. In terms of large language models, because that's really what I care about, I found a few studies suggesting they might be useful, but there's some huge caveats here that I don't want you to forget. So if they are adapted into extensively modified interfaces, so this is not just using ChatGPT off the shelf, this is where the instructor has done a lot of work to make sure that the LLM is, only providing certain information and in a certain way, and giving a lot of scaffolding. So basically, this study here looked at flipped classroom. So essentially, flipped classroom is where before the class, the students are supposed to do a bunch, and then during the class, they basically supplement that classes into lecture. And so they compared a flipped classroom without ChatGPT versus one with ChatGPT support, but what the instructor did is they provide prompts and explanations and sort of scaffolded the students through using it. The other thing I'll note is that, again, they're not matching for time spent. So the learning by ChatGPT, they're spending a lot more time in advance. When they do this, though, it turns out that the group that had ChatGPT ended up doing better on an assessment task. So yes, maybe that's helpful. Again, though, you don't know if it's just sheer practice time, and regardless, it's sort of ChatGPT with extensive instructor scaffolding and prompting to make sure that the LLM is being used in the right way. And I think that's kind of key, and doesn't necessarily say something about just using an LLMs on your own. Still, it's sort of something. And there's a similar thing I found in computer science, where basically they they built a purpose-built app that has an LLM backend. So it provides feedback in a structured way on exercises, and it turns out the people who had the access to the tutor did better on a later assessment. Again, these are really pretty small sample sizes, and again, it's a purpose-built app that they've figured out what is the kind of feedback that it needs to use, and help the students use it. This is not general LLM usage. Okay, so that is something, though. You could also ask about, how does ChatGPT or whatever help with motivation? Because you can see, it could be one or the other. Maybe it's, if you're really struggling, you need more feedback than the student can, or than the teacher can provide. ChatGPT might really help with your motivation, leading to better performance. Or maybe it undermines it because you end up feeling less and less confident about what you can do on your own. There's a lot of studies on this, but so many of them, I had such a hard time finding ones that weren't confounded, because what almost all of them do is they self-rate. They're asking people to self-assess, not just their confidence. That's a fair thing to ask people to self-assess, but also their competence. Like, yes, I understand it, which, as we've seen, part of the problem with these LLMs is that they don't give people good sense about their own competence, because the LLM's doing a bunch. You need some objective measure of competence as well. Also, a lot of these things have really small sample size, lack of control, so you don't look at people who don't use LLMs, for instance. So I'm reporting here on one of the best ones, just so I can give you a sense of the style of study here, and how, even though this is one of the best ones, it has some of these problems, so you can see why this is a problem. I'm really not meaning to pick on this. As I said, I think it's one of the best ones. I still find it not very convincing. So what most of these studies do, and this one did as well, is they essentially just had people fill out surveys on a bunch of stuff and then looked at how correlated the different parts of the surveys were with each other. So in this one, they essentially, students asked a bunch of questions on what they called AI capability. There are things like, does our school and teachers support AI in learning? Fair enough. But you'll notice that this is heavily confounded with just, is our school and teachers supportive in general? I suspect that any relationships they're finding are this sense of feeling supported and not about AI at all. But as it is, since they didn't ask about that or split it out, then we have no idea if, what's going on there. Also ask people about their critical thinking. This is their self-reported critical thinking, not whether they actually can critically think. Their attitude, which is a fair enough thing to self-report, because people know their own feelings best, and their general sense of self-efficacy. So I think these last two are okay to self-report. It's just these first two that are problematic. And what they find, not surprisingly, is that everything is related to everything. In fact, in particular, the artificial intelligence capability is very highly related to learning motivation, and that is to critical thinking. But again, remember that artificial intelligence capability is essentially cannot be disentangled from, I feel supported by my school and my teachers. So I don't find that persuasive. That said, at least it's not a negative relationship. So, so there we go. Now, one thing that there is some evidence that I actually believe and is in high quality studies for is that LLMs might actually help in certain kinds of creativity, and particularly brainstorming. But there's a huge caveat at the end. Still, let's look at this, because I do think these are pretty high quality studies. So the typical task, these are very, very common tasks in the literature on studying creativity. They're essentially brainstorming or, divergent thinking tasks. So, you say, hey, can you come up with a new toy for a child using these three random items, a water bottle and a paper clip and a paper bag, right? Or what's a new way of using an old tennis racket and a hose? Or think of a gift for a teenage girl, and then just have people list as many things as they could do. And then you can have separate measures, different people, experts or other people, just rate how creative those ideas are. Again, these are very standard tests. They've been used for decades, and you can get pretty reliable estimates of creativity this way. So what they've done is, in this study in 2024, they compared people who were either allowed to use ChatGPT on this task or people who weren't, but they could use web search if they wanted. And they just those people came up with ideas, other people rated those ideas, and basically they're like, oh, the people who were allowed to use ChatGPT were rated as more creative in various ways, right? And then another study essentially, I say replicated it. I think it was slightly earlier actually, but just not as well powered and diverse. But they replicated, but they also found that sort of qualitatively, the people who used LLMs had less confident in their own creative ability, right? So it undermined their sense of self-agency a bit, or motivation. But the biggest caveat is with this final study, which huge sample size, lots and lots of different tasks. Essentially, what they found is that yes, it does help individuals be more creative, but if you look at the set of ideas created by all the individuals, that was actually much less creative than the set where people used web search or their own brains. Essentially, what ChatGPT is doing is making everyone be creative in the same way. They're all looking like each other. Not surprising. They're using the same thing as each other, right? So individually, it might make you be more creative than you would otherwise, but you're not going to come up with a super creative idea that you might otherwise have done because you used ChatGPT, and that sort of exhausted you out of it. What I take this from is if you're going to use ChatGPT with brainstorming, brainstorm as much as you can first, and then maybe use ChatGPT to augment that. But if you use only ChatGPT, you'll never think of the weird, totally creative thing you might have come up with otherwise. It would be different from what everyone else would be. If you want to look like everyone, use ChatGPT. If you want to look like you, maybe don't, or at least don't first. So to summarize, when are LLMs helpful? I thought they might be helpful with second language learning. Maybe on the things that haven't been studied, like as conversational partners, but there's really not much research that I could find looking at that versus using, bespoke platforms, which are AI designed, to provide feedback and stuff rather than LLMs. These purpose-built systems, maybe some of them do help, but a lot of them, they lacked, proper controls, equating the amount of time spent with each. And also it's unclear what, whether they generalize to general LLM usage. And the reason I'm making this distinction is because I think that's a detail that gets lost. You can say, oh, this study found that AI really helped with this, and people come away thinking, oh, that means I can use ChatGPT for this. It doesn't mean that necessarily. What you can do with a bespoke platform that's designed specifically for something is not necessarily at all what you can do with ChatGPT. And what we've used with, similar problems with studying the motivation, so much of this work, it's so heavily confounded and based on self-report in a way that I don't find that credible. So we can't rule these out. This is still in its early days, but I've not found good evidence for any of this. The one thing that I think there is decent evidence that's well-powered, well-designed studies with good sample sizes that are replicated is with creativity. But even there, what the evidence shows is that it might make individual people more creative than they would be on their own, but as a group, but it makes them all creative in the same way. And so if you want to be unique and come up with ideas that are different from what other people did, then you probably still don't want to use ChatGPT. So that's what I mean by a monkey's paw situation. All right, so yeah, that's the summary. There's no strong evidence that LLMs are helpful, other than for brainstorming. Again, we do need more research, but that's what I've found so far. And even with brainstorming, LLMs, what they do is they make us look like each other. They hurt us collectively by diminishing our uniqueness and the total creativity of people. When are they not helpful? Well, let's start with psychological impacts. Again, you have similar confounds and problems as with the studies showing they're not helpful. I found a few uh, generally better quality studies have some of those, but let's see what they say. So this study essentially, and this is not unusual, I think, finds that people who are more lonely and have fewer friends, they do actually perceive AI as giving them some social support. Um, uh, but this is associated with a lower GPA. And again, there's huge problems with causation here, right? So if there were no AI, would they go out and make friends and um, and then you know get their social support that way, and then you wouldn't have this relationship with AI or with GPA? Or if there weren't AI, would they just be even lonelier and it'd be even worse? It's really hard to tell with an association study like this. This study I liked because it actually tried to separate the time points, so you can say a little more. Not still, it's not perfect, but this is really hard to study perfectly. In this study, what they did is they had 3 time points. In the first time point, they just measured things like your workload and how pressured you feel and how much you care about sort of, quality and stuff like that. So um, it's just sort of your external stressors, more or less. Um, in time two, they just measured chat GPT usage. These were separated by several weeks. And then in time three, they measured things like your procrastination or your memory loss. And then there was an objective measure of academic performance, which is really nice, right? Which is just their cumulative GPA. And what they found is that, so the relationship between time two and time three, so previous estimated workload and time pressure, was associated with using ChatGPT more. So basically, people are using it when they feel pressured. Again, you can't completely disconfound the causal thing. Maybe they were always using ChatGPT, and that's part of why they felt pressured. You can't say for sure, but we do know that there was a time one estimate of their workload and their pressure, and time two estimate of ChatGPT. The most interesting thing, though, is from time two to time three, where we found basically if they're using ChatGPT more, that's associated with greater procrastination, greater memory loss, so they don't remember what they studied as much, and a lower cumulative GPA. Now, notice this is cumulative GPA. It's not just their immediate GPA. Um, uh, and again, we can't entirely tease out cause and effect here. Maybe it was just the people with a lower GPA felt more workload and then used it and whatever. But at the very, very least, it's not suggesting that ChatGPT is helping, right? Um, and and again, this is as close as you can get if you're not doing an actual intervention where you force some people to use ChatGPT and don't. It's as close as you can get to try to infer sort of cause, right? Um, and in any case, both of these sort of show associations between LLM use and poor psychological functioning. Again, the cause and effect question is really, really tangled. But I'm not seeing evidence. Yay, we should be using LLMs from this. Let's look at actual learning. So I'm going to start with just sort of some evidence from my own subject. So I teach third-year undergraduate statistics to psychology students who mostly are not thrilled about statistics. And what I did is I set up a kind of way to measure for myself. I was just curious, like how much the suspected LLM use in this subject is tied to their later learning. Now, and this is a subject where I tell them, please don't use LLMs, but of course I can't actually follow them around and check. So what I did is on one of the problem sets, um, uh, you can kind of flag the people who at least are using LLMs in a dumb way, because the problem sets all say you can only use the stuff I taught in the subject on the problem set. So if people answer a question using something that was not taught in the subject, then that's very, very strongly associated with LLM use, particularly because I also ran my questions through LLMs and I know the kinds of answers they were given. So what we did is for problem set 2, we just basically tagged them as, based on answers to these questions is no evidence of AI use on this problem set. Maybe they did and they were good at hiding it, in which case I'd argue that, they actually had to learn about it themselves. And then we said maybe they used it and likely they used it. And sort of gratifyingly to me, most people actually did not appear to use it, or at least used it so well we couldn't tell. But my real question was, how is that associated with their performance? So you can see that the people with no evidence of using AI, in Australia, the subjects are scaled differently than in America or in the UK. This is quite a pretty average performance, decent on the assessments in the subject. The people who maybe used AI on their problem set too, they actually were associated with slightly lower performance later on, especially the ones who likely used AI. The real question, though, is for the exam, which was a multiple choice, invigilated, in-person exam. There's no way that anyone could use ChatGPT or an LLM on it. So how did that compare? And what you can really see is that the ones who were tagged, and by the way, I tagged them and only did this analysis after all the final grades were in, and this is multiple choices, objectively scored. You can see that the ones that were tagged as possibly using AI on their problem set, they did much worse on the exam. This is astonishingly worse. So they were basically at 50% on the exam, a full standard deviation or more under the ones who had no evidence of it. And as a result, they did much worse in the subject too, right? So again, you can't tease apart cause and effect entirely, but at the very least, it does not appear that using the LLM is helping them. And the actual published research shows a similar finding, right? So in this study, they basically, this was for high school students learning math, and they varied whether they had no LLM usage or were given either ChatGPT without a sort of purpose-built, tutor of it, and guardrails designed by the instructor, or a bespoke one where the instructor, they tried to design the tutor a little bit better. So on the practice problems where they could actually use ChatGPT, the ChatGPT people did better on the practice problems, as you'd expect. But again, thinking about what we know about human learning, the real question is, how did they do when they didn't have ChatGPT? Did it actually help them learn better? So on the exam, what we found is that the ones who just used ChatGPT without the guardrails, they did worse, right? So they thought they did better. They did better on the practice problems, but they actually learned less. They did worse on the exam. And the one that sort of was the bespoke one with the guardrails, they didn't perform any different than the ones who didn't use it. The more interesting thing, well, actually, this is very interesting, but the other interesting thing is that it is the students who used ChatGPT thought they did better, right? They had no good insight into their own knowledge, right? They thought that they understood it better than the ones who didn't, right? Which again suggests that they're using ChatGPT as a crutch and critically not perceiving the extent to which they rely on it. So they've broken the connection between their own performance and their assessment of their own performance. And that is kind of the key skill that you need in order to be able to improve, is to be able to tell when you aren't getting it. And so ChatGPT seems to be undermining that, as well as their actual fact that they're not getting it. And that's, I find, very worrisome. You see similar things in more humanities-ish context. So this is a study on, it's nursing students, but the classes in ethics, right? So it's basically humanities thinking about case studies and how you'd approach them or whatever. And this sort of, what they use is they again, randomly assign people to different groups. I like this random assignment because that way you can tell more about, cause and effect. So they randomly assign them. Either a group could use ChatGPT in their discussing these case studies, or look things up in textbooks. And in both cases, they're talking with other students about these. And then afterwards, they sort of took a test. And what they find is that basically people in the ChatGPT group, relative to the ones who didn't have ChatGPT, they just did worse on almost every, most of the elements of the test. They didn't understand the ethical concepts as well. They didn't analyze things as well, or show very good critical thinking. And a lot of this was traced to they just spent less time engaged in the discussion. So ChatGPT gave them the answer and like, oh, okay, they thought that they understood it better, but they actually had lower on all of these things, right? Fewer resources, less searching, lower reflection, and so forth. Thinking about what I was saying earlier about how practice is unpleasant, the people in the non-ChatGPT group were doing the unpleasant thing, looking up a lot of resources, groping their way through, thinking about this a lot more, and that's why they learned better than the ChatGPT one. A related thing, this is sort of the common thread here, is sort of comparing ChatGPT to web search, right? So in this study, they essentially basically gave people a task. Their task was, I need you to learn about nanoparticles in sunscreen, research this, and then write up some recommendations with justifications to a friend about this, right? And again, randomly assigned to either people who could use web search or ChatGPT to look this up. And so what they found is that the ChatGPT group thought it was an easier task, again, because ChatGPT is doing so much of it. The students were unaware of how much ChatGPT was helping them. Not only did they think it was an easier task, though, they actually did a worse job. So they gave lower quality recommendations. Independent raters rated that, okay? So the same sort of thing is they're relying on it, not realizing the extent they're relying on it, and not learning as well themselves. So basically, large language model usage leads to poor learning, that as far as we can tell in the domains we've studied, but people think it's better, right? And this is why I have such a problem with self-report. You have to look at the actual performance and not just people's perceived performance, because it screws up the relationship between their knowledge and their sense of their knowledge. And that really damages our agency as future learners, because we're totally miscalibrated. We don't know what we know versus not. Fundamentally, what a lot of this is going on is it has to do with what I was talking about in the last video about the sort of putting things into long-term memory versus short-term memory. When we're putting stuff into long-term memory, what essentially we're doing is we're lowering our cognitive load because we're freeing up our short-term memory to handle more complicated stuff. LLMs are essentially acting as temporary long-term memory storage. They're letting us offload stuff to them. So we have the illusion that we're doing something more complicated, but it's not in our own brains, it's on the LLM. So, essentially they are increasing our cognitive offloading, which is hurting our performance and all these other things. So this is a study showing that. It's, again, an association study with some confounds, some of the same ones as before, but I think it's not as bad because the questions are more sensible and not confounded. So one is literally asking people about their AI usage. Another is asking about their cognitive offloading. This is the confound, I think, because they're defining cognitive offloading as using things like digital technologies and stuff, which is probably going to be highly correlated with AI usage because they're both digital technologies. I would have liked to see some, cognitive offloading things that were some more objective measure of in a task or whatever. But that aside, it's still sort of, we've got these two measures, and then also, again, self-report on critical thinking, same problems as before, and deep thinking. So again, we've got these association measures. Again, some confounds here, but less problematic than the other one because it's not totally confounded with things like just social support in general and that sort of thing. And what they find is that basically using AIs more is associated with lower critical thinking and greater cognitive offloading. And higher cognitive offloading is associated with lower critical thinking. I find this last the most interesting because it's not explainable in a trivial way by these other confounds. And also, more generally, that actual reported AI use is strongly predicted with poor critical thinking. At the very least, this suggests that, again, the AIs aren't helping with that perceived. But let's turn to studies that actually are measuring actual performance, and you can see the same kind of story, right? So this is another of these. Let's compare learning about something using LLMs versus web search. This is a much more extensive set of studies. It's really quite beautiful. Um, uh, um, Again, the sort of similar task where they're basically asked to research and provide advice to a friend. Lots of different things. One of them was about how to plant a vegetable garden. And then so same task as we saw before. This one has 7 different studies, over 10,000 people, lots of variations in it. So this is a pretty robust result. And it also gives them the statistical power to be able to disentangle a lot of the association. So what they found is essentially that people who used web search had more effort in gathering and synthesizing the information in the first place than the LLM. They took longer to do it. So again, it feels probably a little more painful and unpleasant for them to do this task. It's not quite as easy. They're offloading less than the people in the LLM thing are. But this is associated with greater depth of learning and search, so they're searching a lot more. They feel like they're searching more, they own what they learn more, they're internalizing a lot more, and they're actually getting a lot more detailed information from that. And this is associated with basically they care more, they want to make good advice more, they spend longer time, they own it more, so this is their sense of autonomy and agency, and also better advice. So as rated by independent people, it's longer result, it's sort of more, dissimilar from lame things, and unique to each other, and it's more original, essentially. So basically, very, very, I think these are really pretty high quality studies, really showing that it is the process that matters, again, like I was talking about before. So spending the effort, doing the hard stuff, that is what is creating originality and quality and content and ownership on your things. So to summarize then, LLMs empirically, from what we can see in the literature so far, are not helpful. They're associated with worse psychological outcomes, procrastination, less social support. I'll be talking about this a little bit more in the video on the impacts on humans. Lower GPA. Really big caveat that it's very hard to disentangle cause and effect in these studies. They are associations, so keep that in mind. But they are in ways that we can disentangle cause and effect because they're interventions where people are randomly assigned to groups associated with poor learning. They think that it's better learning, and when they're using it, they look better, but when they have to not use it, they actually do worse. And it's sort of worse, higher level skills, less depth of thinking and engagement, analysis, and processing. And so all of these are suggestive that what's happening is that people are offloading learning and work to the LLM, not realizing the extent to which they are doing that, and that's hurting their learning and engagement and autonomy. So we need more research into all of this, but that's my sense of what's going on, and it's quite aligned with my sense of how learning in humans works in the first place. So this is the sort of the result, the nutshell result, that LLM usage does seem to undermine the kind of deep processing and engagement that you need to develop real expertise and critical thinking skills. It makes it so that the practice doesn't happen, and the practice is the point and the necessary part of developing mastery. We do need a lot more research, but I think there's a lot of reason to be wary about the impact of LLMs on human learning. So that was learning, but I'm going to take in the next videos a few steps backwards and talk about the impacts of LLMs on humans and society in other ways. Thank you for sticking with me so far for this, and I'll see you next time.